My parents took my sister on a private safari, said I wouldn't appreciate it anyway. When they came home, I was already moved out, and my silence was louder than any argument. My name is Catherine, and this is about the day my parents chose my sister over me for the last time, and how I made sure they'd never get the chance to do it again. For context, I'm 26 years old, work as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup, and I've been living at home to save money for a house down payment. My sister Stephanie is 23, recently graduated with an art degree, and has been the golden child since birth. While I was getting straight A's and working part-time jobs through college, Stephanie was getting C's and having mom and dad pay for everything from her car to her spring break trips to Europe. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When I graduated summa cum laude, they took us to Applebee's. When Stephanie barely scraped by with a 2.8 GPA, they threw her a graduation party that cost more than my entire college wardrobe. When I got my first promotion, Dad said "That's nice, honey," and went back to his newspaper. When Stephanie sold her first painting for $200 at a local art fair, they acted like she'd just been accepted into the Louvre. But the safari thing? That was the final straw. It started in March when Mom casually mentioned over dinner that they were thinking about taking a family trip somewhere exotic for their 30th wedding anniversary in July. I got excited. We hadn't taken a real family vacation since I was in high school, and I thought maybe this would be a chance for us to reconnect. I even started researching destinations, bookmarking articles about Japan, Iceland, New Zealand. What about an African safari? Stephanie suggested, barely looking up from her phone. My friend went to Kenya last year and said it was life-changing. Mom's eyes lit up immediately. Oh, that sounds amazing. Richard, what do you think? Dad nodded enthusiastically. I've always wanted to see the Big Five in person. Let me look into it. Over the next few weeks, the safari became the only topic of conversation at dinner. Dad would share articles about luxury safari lodges, Mom would show us photos of elephants and lions on her phone, and Stephanie would add destinations to some Pinterest board she'd created. I contributed to researching the best times to visit different parks, looking up photography tips, even finding a great travel agent who specialized in African safaris. I should have seen the signs, but I was genuinely excited about the prospect of this trip. I started saving extra money, researching vaccinations we'd need, even bought a new camera with a telephoto lens specifically for wildlife photography. Then came the bomb. It was a Thursday evening in May. I'd just gotten home from work and was heating up leftover Chinese food when Mom and Dad called Stephanie and me into the living room. They were sitting on the couch with these weird expressions, excited but also nervous. "Girls, we have some news about the safari," Mom began, her voice artificially bright. "We've been working with a travel agent Catherine found, and we've booked the most incredible trip to Tanzania and Kenya." My heart started racing with excitement. This was it. They were going to tell us the dates, the itinerary, all the details I'd been dying to know. "The thing is," Dad continued, and I felt my stomach drop at his tone, "the trip is quite expensive, and we decided it would be better to take a smaller group this time." Stephanie looked confused. "Smaller group? It's just the four of us." Mom and Dad exchanged a look I'd seen 1,000 times before, the look they shared when they were about to prioritize Stephanie over me again. "Well, actually," Mom said slowly, "we thought it would be special to take just Stephanie this time. It's such an artistic destination, with all the beautiful landscapes and wildlife, and we know how much she'd appreciate it from a creative perspective." The room went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I felt like I'd been slapped. "What about Catherine?" Stephanie asked, and for a moment, I thought she was going to stand up for me. Dad shrugged. "Catherine's more of a practical person. She wouldn't appreciate the artistic elements the way you would. Plus, she's always so busy with work, she probably wouldn't even be able to take the time off." "But I've been researching this trip for months," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I bought a new camera. I've been saving money." "Honey," Mom said in that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate, "you can use that camera for other things. And the savings will be great for your house fund." "You said it was a family trip," I pressed, feeling tears starting to build behind my eyes. "For your anniversary." "It is a family trip," Dad said firmly. "Just a smaller family group this time." That's when Stephanie sealed the deal with the most casual cruelty I've ever experienced. "Besides," she said, scrolling through her phone like we were discussing what to have for dinner, "Catherine doesn't really like animals that much anyway. Remember how she wouldn't even pet Anne's rabbit?" I stared at her. "I'm allergic to rabbits, Stephanie. You know that." She shrugged. "Same difference." Mom and Dad were nodding along like this made perfect sense. Like my rabbit allergy somehow disqualified me from appreciating lions and elephants in their natural habitat. "When are you leaving?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why I was torturing myself with details. "July 15th through the 28th, Mom said. 2 weeks in paradise." July 15th. The exact dates I'd already requested off work, anticipating this trip. I excused myself and went to my room, where I cried until my eyes were swollen and my head was pounding. But somewhere between the tears and the tissue box, something shifted inside me. The hurt started transforming into something else, something colder and more determined. They wanted to exclude me? Fine. But they were about to learn that exclusion works both ways. The next morning, I started making plans. First, I called my friend Helen, who worked in real estate. I need to find an apartment, I told her. Something available by mid-July. My budget is $1,800 a month. I thought you were saving for a house, she said. Change of plans. Helen found me a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a converted warehouse downtown, with exposed brick walls and huge windows. The landlord was looking for someone to move in quickly, and I signed the lease that afternoon. Next, I called my cousin Daniel, who owned a moving company. I need to move out of my parents' house, I told him. While they're out of town. Can you help? Everything okay? He asked. It will be. Daniel agreed to help me move on July 16th, the day after my parents and Stephanie left for their safari. Then came the hard part, keeping my mouth shut for 2 months. I went about my normal routine, saying nothing about the apartment, nothing about my hurt feelings, nothing about my plans. When they talked about the safari at dinner, which they did constantly, I just nodded and ate my food. When Stephanie showed me the new clothes she bought for the trip, I said they looked nice. When Mom asked me to water the plants while they were gone, I said of course. I was a ghost living in that house, already halfway gone. The night before they left, Mom made a big show of hugging me goodbye. We'll bring you back something special, she promised. That's not necessary, I said, and I meant it. Dad handed me a list of things to do while they were gone: water the plants, get the mail, make sure the house looked lived in. You're the responsible one, he said, like it was a compliment instead of a consolation prize. I'll take care of everything, I promised, and I would, just not the way they expected. The morning of July 16th, I woke up before dawn. Daniel and his crew arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, and we got to work. I'd been secretly packing for weeks, so most of my belongings were already in boxes. My books, my clothes, my kitchen supplies, my furniture, everything that was mine came with me. The hardest part was my childhood bedroom. I'd lived in that room for 18 years, and packing it up felt like erasing a whole chapter of my life. But I was ready for a new chapter. I left behind anything they'd given me that I didn't truly need or want. The jewelry that was always slightly wrong for my taste, the books I'd never asked for, the decorative items that had never felt like me. If it didn't spark joy or serve a practical purpose in my new life, it stayed behind. By 2 p.m., the house was cleared of all traces of me, but I wasn't done. I went to the grocery store and bought everything they'd need for a few days after they got back: milk, bread, eggs, basics. I stocked the refrigerator and pantry so they wouldn't come home to an empty kitchen. I watered all the plants, brought in the mail, even vacuumed the living room. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Mom, Dad, and Stephanie, I hope you had a wonderful time on your safari. I'm sure the photos are beautiful and the memories will last a lifetime. I've moved out. My new address is attached if you need it for anything official, but please don't feel obligated to visit or call. I understand that my presence isn't necessary for your family happiness, and I'm finally in a position to honor that. I've taken only what was mine and left everything else exactly as you'd want it. The house is clean, the plants are watered, and I've stocked the kitchen with basics to get you through your first few days back. Don't worry about me, I'm exactly where I want to be. I hope you can say the same. Catherine. P.S. The camera I bought for the safari takes excellent photos of city wildlife. The pigeons outside my new apartment are surprisingly photogenic. I left the letter on the kitchen table, placed my house key beside it, and walked out the front door for the last time. The silence that followed was the most peaceful thing I'd ever experienced. My new apartment was everything I dreamed of. The exposed brick walls made it feel like a cozy loft, and the huge windows filled the space with natural light. I arranged my furniture exactly the way I wanted it, hung my own artwork on the walls, and created a space that was entirely, unapologetically mine. For 2 weeks, I lived in blissful silence. No passive-aggressive comments at dinner, no stories about Stephanie's latest artistic triumph, no subtle reminders that I was the practical, responsible, unappreciated daughter. Just me, my coffee, my books, and the city pigeons that had indeed turned out to be surprisingly photogenic. I threw myself into work with renewed energy. Without the daily drain of family drama, I found myself more creative, more focused, more engaged with my projects. My boss noticed the change immediately. You seem different, she said during our weekly one-on-one. More present. I've made some changes in my personal life, I told her. I'm feeling more like myself. She smiled. Well, keep it up. The Morrison campaign you designed last week was brilliant. The difference was remarkable. At home, I'd been carrying the invisible weight of constant disappointment, always bracing myself for the next casual dismissal or comparison to Stephanie. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending on managing my reactions, swallowing my hurt, and performing the role of the understanding, practical daughter who never needed anything. Now, free from that exhausting performance, I found myself contributing ideas in meetings I never would have shared before. I volunteered for challenging projects instead of just doing what was assigned to me. When my colleague Mark suggested I present our Q3 marketing strategy to the board of directors, I said yes immediately instead of deflecting to someone else. "I don't think I've ever seen you this confident," said my coworker Julie after the presentation, which had gone incredibly well. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." What I was doing was finally living as my authentic self instead of the diminished version I'd become at home. I started exploring my new neighborhood, trying restaurants I'd never heard of, visiting galleries and bookstores within walking distance of my apartment. There was a small Ethiopian place 3 blocks away that became my regular Friday night spot. The owner, a woman named Ruth, started recognizing me and would recommend new dishes based on what she thought I'd like. There was something deeply satisfying about being known for my actual preferences instead of being the daughter who wouldn't appreciate things anyway. The independent bookstore on the corner became my weekend sanctuary. I'd spend hours browsing sections I'd never explored before: poetry, philosophy, travel memoirs written by people who'd taken the kinds of trips my family thought I wouldn't appreciate. I bought books about African wildlife photography and discovered that I had strong opinions about composition and lighting that I'd never had the chance to develop. I signed up for a photography class at a community college and discovered that I actually had a good eye for urban landscapes. The instructor, an older man named George, was particularly impressed with a series I shot of construction workers building a new high-rise. "You have an interesting perspective," he told me after class one evening. "Most people photograph buildings. You're photographing the human story behind the buildings." I'd never thought of myself as having an artistic eye, but free from the constant narrative that Stephanie was the creative one and I was the practical one, I found myself seeing the world differently. The morning light hitting the brick wall outside my apartment became a study in texture and shadow. The reflection of the city in puddles after rain became an opportunity to capture 2 worlds at once. The photography class led to other discoveries. I learned I enjoy the technical aspects, understanding aperture and shutter speed, problem-solving lighting challenges, the precision required to capture exactly what I was seeing. But I also loved the creative freedom, the way I could frame a story in a single image. One evening, as I was editing photos from a walk through the farmer's market, I realized I was humming. I couldn't remember the last time I'd hummed while doing something I enjoyed. At home, I'd been so focused on not taking up too much space, not being too demanding, not showing too much enthusiasm for things that might be dismissed, that I'd forgotten what pure enjoyment felt like. I made new friends. Helen from real estate became a regular coffee companion, and I connected with my neighbors in ways I never had when I was focused on family obligations. My upstairs neighbor Patricia turned out to be a chef who loved experimenting with new recipes, and we started having weekly dinner parties where she'd cook and I'd handle the wine selection. Patricia was everything I wished I could have been at family dinners: bold with flavors, confident in her choices, unapologetic about taking up space. She'd spend hours perfecting a new sauce, talking through her process with infectious enthusiasm. When she burned a batch of homemade pasta, she laughed it off and ordered pizza instead. "Life's too short to cry over burnt carbs," she said, pouring us both generous glasses of wine. "Besides, failure is just practice in disguise." It was such a different attitude from what I'd grown up with, where mistakes were analyzed and criticized, where taking risks meant facing potential judgment. Patricia's approach to life was bold and experimental, and being around her made me braver. Through Patricia, I met her friend Susan, a graphic designer who worked with small nonprofits, and Susan's partner Michael, who ran a community garden in the neighborhood. They became part of our weekly dinner rotation, and suddenly I had a social circle that revolved around shared interests and genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. Michael invited me to volunteer at the community garden on weekends, and I discovered I loved the physical work of planting and weeding, the satisfaction of seeing seeds grow into vegetables that would feed local families. There was something healing about working with my hands, about contributing to something that had nothing to do with marketing campaigns or family dynamics. "You're a natural," Michael told me one Saturday as we harvested tomatoes together. "Have you ever considered growing your own food?" I laughed. "I've been living at home until recently. My mom has very specific ideas about what the yard should look like." "Well, you've got those big windows in your apartment," he said. "Herb garden? Cherry tomatoes? You could probably grow enough basil to keep Patricia supplied for her cooking experiments." That afternoon, I went to the garden center and bought my first plants: basil, mint, oregano, and a small cherry tomato plant that I positioned carefully in my sunniest window. Watching those plants grow over the following weeks became a daily meditation, a reminder that I was nurturing something that was entirely mine. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself instead of trying to earn approval I was never going to get. The change wasn't just emotional, it was physical too. I'd been carrying tension in my shoulders for years, a tightness I'd attributed to work stress but now realized was the physical manifestation of constantly bracing myself for disappointment. My sleep improved dramatically. I'd been waking up multiple times a night at my parents' house, some part of my subconscious always alert for the next crisis or criticism. Now I slept deeply and woke up refreshed. I started taking evening walks through my neighborhood, something I'd never done at home because I was always worried about missing some family interaction or obligation. These walks became my favorite part of the day, an hour of pure solitude where I could process my thoughts, notice details about my surroundings, and simply exist without performing any particular role. During one of these walks, about 3 weeks after I'd moved out, I ran into my high school friend Jane at a coffee shop. We'd lost touch after graduation when she went to college on the West Coast, but she'd recently moved back to town for a job. "Catherine. Oh my God, it's so good to see you," she said, pulling me into a hug. "You look amazing. There's something different about you." We sat down to catch up, and I found myself telling her about the move, the new apartment, the photography class. I didn't mention the safari situation specifically, just said I decided it was time to live independently. "Good for you," Jane said firmly. "I remember your family dynamic from high school. Your sister was always the star, and you were always in the background taking care of everyone else." It was startling to hear someone else articulate what I'd never been able to name so clearly. "You noticed that? Are you kidding? It was obvious to everyone except you. Remember junior year when you got accepted to that competitive summer journalism program, but you turned it down because your parents wanted you to babysit Stephanie while they went on their cruise?" I did remember, though I'd buried that memory deep. I'd wanted that program desperately. It was at Northwestern and would have looked incredible on college applications. But Mom had said they were counting on me to watch Stephanie, and Dad had said the journalism program would still be there next year. It wasn't, they only offered it that one summer. I convinced myself it wasn't that important, I told Jane. But it was important. You talked about being a journalist for months. And when you gave it up, you just didn't. Like you decided your dreams weren't worth fighting for. Sitting there with Jane, I realized that the safari wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of a lifetime of being told, in small and large ways, that my dreams and desires were less important than everyone else's convenience. "I'm not that person anymore," I told her, and as I said it, I knew it was true. "I can see that," Jane smiled. "You're taking up space again. I like it." We exchanged numbers and made plans to meet the following week. As I walked home that evening, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for reconnecting with an old friend, but for becoming someone worth reconnecting with. The most surprising change was how I felt about my own company. At home, I'd been so focused on managing relationships and avoiding conflict that I'd never learned to enjoy solitude. Now, my Saturday mornings alone with coffee and a book weren't something to endure until social obligations kicked in, they were something to savor. I started cooking elaborate meals just for myself, not because I was lonely but because I deserved good food regardless of whether anyone else was there to appreciate it. I'd put on music, pour myself a glass of wine, and spend an hour making pasta from scratch or trying a new recipe I'd found online. These solo dinner parties became a form of self-care I'd never experienced before. I'd set the table properly, light candles, plate the food beautifully, and eat slowly while reading or listening to a podcast. It was the opposite of the rushed, anxious meals I'd eaten at home, always worried about saying the wrong thing or not showing enough enthusiasm for Stephanie's latest project. One evening, as I was enjoying a particularly successful attempt at homemade risotto, my phone rang. It was my friend Sandra from college, whom I hadn't spoken to in months. "Catherine, I hope you don't mind me calling out of the blue," she said, "but I just had the strangest conversation with your mother." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "She called me asking if I'd heard from you. She seemed really worried, said you'd moved out without any explanation and weren't returning their calls. She asked if I thought you were having some kind of mental health crisis." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety that always came with my mother's manipulations. Even when I wasn't speaking to her, she was finding ways to control the narrative, to make my boundaries about my supposed instability rather than their behavior. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that you were an adult and if you weren't speaking to them, they should probably examine why instead of trying to go around you to your friends," Sandra said firmly. "But Catherine, what's really going on? I've never known you to cut off contact with anyone." I found myself telling Sandra the whole story, the safari, the casual dismissal, the years of feeling invisible in my own family. As I talked, I could hear my own voice growing stronger, more certain. "Jesus, Catherine," Sandra said when I finished. "I had no idea it was that bad. I mean, I knew Stephanie was the golden child, but I didn't realize how much it was affecting you." "I didn't realize it either, until I wasn't living in it anymore," I admitted. "Are you happy?" she asked. "With the decision to move out, I mean?" I looked around my apartment, at the plants thriving in the window, at the photos I'd taken and framed on the walls, at the evidence of a life I was building entirely for myself. "I'm happier than I've ever been," I said, and I meant it completely. The phone calls started on July 29th, the day after they returned from safari. I was at work when my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Catherine, we're home. Where are you?" I didn't respond. An hour later, Dad called. I let it go to voicemail. "Catherine, this is your father. We got your letter, and we need to talk. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. I deleted the message. Stephanie texted next, "What the hell, Catherine? Mom is crying." I blocked her number. The calls and texts continued for 3 days. Each message was more frantic than the last, but I didn't respond to any of them. I'd spent 26 years trying to communicate with these people, trying to explain my feelings, trying to be understood. The Safari decision had made it clear that communication was pointless. They'd already decided who I was and what I was worth to them. Now it was time for them to sit with the consequences of that decision. On Friday evening, I was cooking dinner when there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw Mom, Dad, and Stephanie standing in the hallway looking exhausted and worried. I didn't open the door. "Catherine," Mom called through the door, "please, honey, we just want to talk." "We know you're in there," Dad added. "Your car is in the parking garage." I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, until they finally gave up and left. That weekend, Helen called to check on me. "Your parents stopped by the office," she said. "They wanted to know if I knew where you were." "What did you tell them?" "That client information is confidential," she said firmly. "But Catherine, they seemed really upset." "I'm sure they are," I said. "They're not upset about losing me, they're upset about losing their sense of control." "Are you sure you don't want to at least talk to them?" "Maybe explain." "Helen," I interrupted gently, "I spent 26 years explaining myself to people who weren't interested in understanding. I'm done." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "But you know I'm here if you need anything." "I know. Thank you." The weeks turned into months. The calls and texts eventually stopped, though I occasionally heard through mutual friends that my parents were telling people I'd had some kind of breakdown and moved out without explanation. They painted themselves as the confused, hurt parents who couldn't understand why their daughter had abandoned them. I let them tell whatever story they needed to tell. The people who mattered knew the truth, and the people who didn't matter weren't worth correcting. In October, my cousin Daniel called with an update. He'd run into Dad at the hardware store, and Dad had asked if he knew how to reach me. He looked terrible, Daniel told me. Like he hasn't been sleeping. He said they'd been to therapy trying to figure out what went wrong. "What did you tell him?" "That if he wanted to reach you, he had your contact information from the letter you left." I smiled. "Thank you." "Catherine," Daniel said carefully, "he asked me to tell you something." "What?" "He said to tell you they're sorry. That they realize they made a mistake with the Safari thing, and they want to make it right." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the old urge to give in, to go back, to accept their apology and pretend everything was fine. But then I remembered sitting in that living room while they explained why I wouldn't appreciate the trip, while Stephanie casually dismissed my feelings, while they nodded along like my exclusion was perfectly reasonable. "Daniel," I said, "if someone punches you in the face and then apologizes, are you required to let them punch you again?" "No, of course not." "Then why would emotional punches be any different?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I get it," he said finally. "Just don't close the door forever, okay? People can change." "Maybe," I said. "But I'm not holding my breath." In November, I got a promotion at work, senior marketing coordinator with a substantial raise and my own office. I celebrated by taking myself to the fanciest restaurant in the city and ordering a bottle of wine that cost more than my parents had ever spent on a birthday dinner for me. As I sat there, looking out at the city lights through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized something profound. I was genuinely happy. Not the forced, people-pleasing happiness I'd performed for years, but real, deep contentment with my life and my choices. I'd spent so many years trying to earn love that was always conditional, always just out of reach. Now I was learning to give that love to myself, and it turned out to be more than enough. In December, I got a Christmas card addressed to my new apartment. Inside was a family photo from the safari, Mom, Dad, and Stephanie grinning in front of a sunset over the African savanna. They looked happy and relaxed, exactly the way they should look on the trip of a lifetime. There was no note, no message, just the photo. But I understood what they were trying to say. Look what you missed. Look what you chose to give up. But looking at that photo, all I felt was relief. Relief that I hadn't been there to be the responsible one, the practical one, the one taking photos of everyone else instead of being in them. Relief that I hadn't spent 2 weeks being reminded that I was the add-on, the afterthought, the daughter who wouldn't appreciate it anyway. I put the photo in a drawer and went back to wrapping presents for my new friends, Patricia, Helen, Daniel, my coworkers who'd become my chosen family. On Christmas Eve, Patricia and I cooked dinner together in my apartment. We made way too much food, drank excellent wine, and talked about our plans for the new year. As I looked around my apartment, at the twinkling lights I'd strung up, at the small tree decorated with ornaments I'd chosen myself, at the stack of books I was excited to read, I felt something I'd never experienced during a family Christmas, complete peace. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stephanie, texting from a new number I hadn't blocked yet. "It's Christmas Eve. Don't you think this has gone on long enough?" I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Patricia looked at me with concern. Everything okay? Everything's perfect, I said, and I meant it. 8 months later, here I am, writing this story. I've been living in my apartment for most of this time, and I can honestly say it's been the best period of my adult life. I've traveled to 3 new cities, learned to cook Thai food, taken up rock climbing, and started dating a wonderful man named Andrew who thinks I'm fascinating exactly as I am. I still live in the same city as my parents, but I might as well be on another planet. We move in completely different circles now, and I prefer it that way. I've built a life that's entirely my own, surrounded by people who see my worth and appreciate my presence. Sometimes people ask if I miss my family, if I regret my decision to cut contact. The answer is complicated. I miss the idea of having a loving, supportive family. I miss the fantasy of parents who would choose inclusion over exclusion, who would fight for me instead of dismissing me. But I don't miss the reality of who they actually were to me. I don't regret leaving. I don't regret the silence. I don't regret choosing myself for once in my 26 years. The safari was never really about the safari. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been going on my entire life, a pattern of them deciding I wasn't worth including, wasn't worth celebrating, wasn't worth fighting for. The safari was just the moment I finally decided I agreed with them, I wasn't worth that kind of treatment. So I removed myself from the equation entirely. They got their perfect family safari with their golden child. I got my freedom, my peace, and my self-respect back. In the end, we all got exactly what we deserved. Some people might say I overreacted, that I should have given them a chance to explain or apologize. But here's the thing about apologies, they're meaningless if the behavior doesn't change. And after 26 years of the same pattern, I wasn't interested in waiting around to see if the 27th year would be different. My silence wasn't punishment, it was protection. Protection for the person I was finally becoming when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their best effort. They taught me that I wouldn't appreciate it anyway. Turns out, they were right about one thing, I don't appreciate being treated like an afterthought. I don't appreciate being dismissed and excluded and made to feel grateful for scraps. But I do appreciate my new life. I appreciate my apartment with its perfect morning light. I appreciate my friends who show up for me consistently. I appreciate my job where my contributions are valued. I appreciate my Saturday mornings with coffee and photography walks through the city. I appreciate the person I've become in the silence they thought would bring me back to them. The funny thing about going no contact is that people always assume you're angry, that you're punishing someone, that you're waiting for them to grovel enough to earn your forgiveness. But the truth is much simpler and much scarier for people who've lost someone this way. Sometimes, people just move on. Sometimes, the silence isn't a cry for attention or a manipulation tactic. Sometimes, it's just peace. And sometimes, that peace is worth more than any safari could ever be.